Was there a particular moment when your Christian faith really directly influenced a medical decision that you made when treating someone?
That I was telling you before, I never really got to speak to God, but I do think that people speak through my patients. How do these Christian beliefs kind of aid me in the moment? Are there any case studies for that? I mean, one quick story essentially is there was like an 18-month-old toddler, or that was dying from a terrible congenital abnormality. He had Down syndrome, and sadly, his parents dropped him off basically in an ICU, and he spent pretty much those 18 months in an ICU. He never left the hospital. And what's also sad about that, his parents didn't come to visit him. In fact, at some point, the nurses and staff there probably knew more about this child day to day than the family did. And it just so happened that as I was switching over to completing this rotation at this pediatric ICU, that it was very clear to us that this child was going to die. He was on some equipment called high flow that literally poured 50 liters of oxygen in through his nose and his mouth to help him get oxygen to the rest of his body. And that was failing him. So if you can imagine,
Wow.
That's a tremendous amount of oxygen. So we knew that it was futile. We knew that family wasn't going to come. And I knew that this child was not going to get any religious moment in his life. So what can you do? I had 4 kids at the time. I still have 4 kids, but they were all very young. And so what I did is what any Christian father does. And I just essentially chanted or sang a song for that child in his last moments. And it's funny, because it's a very simple song, and it was a sweet song. But I'll tell you, I can't tell you how many nurses came up to me afterwards and just said how special that moment was. And the reality is that if I hadn't been a Christian, if I hadn't had maybe some traditions that had been taught me, like, what would I have done in that moment? And what would I have done is what everyone else did, which is kind of just watch and wait. And so we put this child to sleep, and, he had the hymn itself was called Of Thy Mystic Supper. Interestingly, we sing that right before we have communion, which is the very end of liturgy, sort of the pinnacle moment, but speaks about preparing your soul and asking God to allow you to receive communion, essentially salvation. But that was the last hymn that this child ever heard before he was put to sleep. But you can also imagine, too, you're trying to make sense of that moment and why his parents weren't there, and it's very easy to become judgmental.